All right, well, if any of you heard my talk earlier this morning, I talked about trying repeatedly to disengage from Channel Islands archaeology and move to the northwest where I live. And I over the years have been fond of saying that I just, every single time I go to the Channel Islands, it seems like I find something that knocks my socks off. And you'd think after 32 years or 34 years of being out there, that it, would get repetitive and redundant and you wouldn't find anything new. We still find amazing stuff every time we go to the Channel Islands, and this may be the most amazing of all. But I think it exemplifies the extraordinary nature of the archaeology of the Channel Islands and what they can tell us, not only about the really ancient past, but about much younger periods and historic periods of transformation and transition too. I think that was a fabulous film, and Lisa, that was a great presentation and overview and props and the whole thing. And I also want to say that the Navy, the U.S. Navy, has done an extraordinary job, Lisa and Steve, and of working with this cache and working with a complex group of people and multiple institutions to care for these things, to conserve them, to document them, and now to present them to you and the public as well. During the late 18th and early 19th century, colonialism, globalization, this was a period of major transition, both ecologically and culturally along the Pacific coast and also on the Channel Islands. And it included contacts between California Indian people, the Chumash, the Nicoleno, Island Tongva, Europeans, and in some instances, Native Alaskans. And this was, as the film pointed out, a completely unexpected discovery because we were looking for early Holocene sites and terminal Pleistocene sites. What that's meant on San Miguel Island, and it means you ignore the big sites up on the dunes, because the dunes generally blew in the middle Holocene and the late Holocene, and you follow these ancient soils that are exposed in the sea cliff right along here, right above this raised beach. And I just happened to be walking along here and, one late fall day, and as Lisa said, in the right place at the right time, and looked down and saw what I thought was a fossil, a whale rib in a raised beach, climbed down to look at it, and was astounded to find a redwood box underneath it with the side blown off or fallen off. I looked inside, sort of crouched on the edge of this sea cliff, and saw something shiny, picked out a piece of green glass, and then something else shiny, picked out a steatite tube bead, something else shiny, and it was a steatite effigy, and I can't remember, something else. And then I slapped myself up the head and said, "You idiot, stop pulling things out of the box." And went and found my colleagues. And, we had to change everything, our entire plan for the next 24 hours, basically, because the nature of this discovery and the nature of the threats to it required an immediate response. And so we huddled, talked about what to do, came out very early the next morning, and tried our best to salvage this with thorough documentation and to get these redwood boxes into bankers' boxes that could be put in a safe facility for the kind of meticulous excavation and documentation that was done. Extraordinary project with extraordinary implications. And so here we are, in the initial phases of trying to expose the redwood boxes and the contents outside the boxes. And there's a view very early on with the one on the right. That's the west box, the one that was open that I was pulling things out of. The east box to the other side was much less well preserved. You can see kind of a capping piece that's collapsing there. And here's the piece that blew off. These, I'm not going to say a lot about the structure of the boxes today, but they're all redwood, planks, bases, tops. They have a multitude of holes in them that look like lashing holes. There are ones on the corners of most of the intact box planks that look like they were probably for lashing the boxes together. But there are also numerous other holes along the edges that suggest that these are probably recycled canoe planks. And they actually look like they were put together relatively expediently. There was asphaltum. You can see a little bit of asphaltum along the base here. So the sides of the boxes were glued on to the base with asphaltum and then probably lashed in the corners, but they weren't really strong. And importantly, they weren't of Northwest Coast origin. This is classic Channel Island type of construction. I've worked for years up in Alaska on Kodiak in southeast Alaska. And up there, if we're going to have boxes, they're going to be bentwood boxes. And they're going to look quite different, very different construction style. Here is a composite of the feature that was compiled by me by notes and going out in the field with Lisa and trying to figure things out. And then Rusty Rand Rossman produced this recently, so it shows the two boxes and its association with the water bottles and black ab shells and other objects surrounding it. And then you saw the film of the very careful, meticulous excavation. I can't tell for sure. This is probably the east box here? Yeah. One of the things I wanted to mention was that as we pulled these two boxes out and placed them into the bankers' boxes, we took out the west box, the better preserved one, essentially intact with the lid on, and it was very well preserved. The east box was much less well preserved, including the top, and it kind of fell apart to some extent. So even when we were in the field putting these things in boxes for later excavation, this one was opened up and the sand shifted a little bit. We could see some of the objects. And I know that iron bar or hoop fragment was one of them. And then we noticed a bone harpoon, classic unilaterally barbed with a line hole. And I went, oh my God, that is not local. This is Alaskan. It was classic material that had to be from either the Northwest Coast, British Columbia, or Alaska. They make things like that up from the Oregon coast basically up to the Aleutians. And then another piece shifted and came out with a toggling harpoon with a copper blade still inset in the tip. You've seen pictures of it, but that was the sinker, you know. I mean, absolutely, that was classic Aleut, Koniag, Alaskan artifact. So that's and you can see one of those right there. This one with a little iron blade, and here's a schist blade, ground schist blade that's probably from the Northwest as well. Come on, sweetie. And here you can see the pipe exposed here. Here's one of those classic Northwest Coast, or probably native Alaskan toggling harpoons. This one has been ground down to a blunt end because the slot that you put the blade into had cracked, it looked like. It looked like they tried to rework it a little bit and then probably gave up on it. So Lisa's shown some of these. The brass button was the other thing that was found that initially that was astounding. Here's some of the Nicoleno style harpoon in the middle, classic Channel Island type of stuff, and then the chipped glass bifaces on either side, really I think in Nicoleno style. Here's the two unilaterally barbed bone harpoons with line holes, absolutely Northwest Coast, native Alaskan. These are really cool. These are bone foreshafts, and this one has a socketed in there and a slotted in there for a blade. This one, I think, is broken on one side, but the big, broader, blunt side is socketed like that, probably for a bone harpoon to be inserted. And if you want to see how that works, here's a historic photo of Aleut hunters, and there's that beautiful socketed foreshaft, and there's the unilaterally barbed harpoon. And there's the 4 toggling harpoons. 3 with metal blades still inset, these 2 in iron. Here's that big copper serrated blade. Here's a side view of that one, and you can see the line hole there in the middle. The other thing you can see is that right there, there's a little curvature on the end of these tines. These are like fork-like tines. All 4 of them have 3 tines. All 4 of them are relatively small compared to many pinniped hunting toggling harpoons in the Northwest, which leads me to believe they were for sea otter hunting, which makes a lot of sense. And when you turn them sideways, each one of them has that little incurve on the end. So they're all very similar, and they're similar enough that I think that it probably represents a single individual or at least a close-knit group and kind of a single event. And these were salvaged and put in the box for later use or reuse. Here's a couple more that are, I'm fairly certain, are Northwest or Native Alaskan. This is a beautiful ground slate blade with, I think, hafting residue here. The tip you can see is broken off. These are typically chipped into rough form and then ground into final form. In this case, it's been ground completely to where the chipping doesn't show anymore. But here's what I think is a ground slate preform that's been chipped on the margins, but it hasn't been ground and probably is unfinished. Here's that groundstone schist, what I think is an adze, and it also has asphaltum down here, which is probably hafting residue, because this is the working end of the adze. Again, not local material and pretty classic Native Alaskan stuff, I think. And then just wrapping it up, here, here's pictures of the larger context. There's some of the Native Alaskan materials, the iron and metals, native Nicoleno. In fact, the vast majority of the artifacts that came out of here, as well as the box construction itself and the water bottles, suggest that this is a Nicoleno feature. And so that leads us to the question, who left it? And I don't know that we can answer at this point. I don't know that we'll ever be able to answer, although there's some hope that with CSI techniques like DNA and things, potentially from the pipe stem or other aspects of the objects in the box, that we may ultimately be able to figure it out. Historical accounts, however, suggest that Juana Maria was Nicoleno, that her people lived on SNI, San Nicolas, for millennia, but she lived alone on SNI from 1835 to 1853, for 18 years before she was rescued and then died within 7 weeks in Santa Barbara. There were, as Susan Hammersmith showed earlier, Susan Morris, Koniag, Aleut sea otter hunters who were brought to San Nicolas Island by Russian Americans and European captains working for the Russians, a variety of kind of commercial enterprises during the the fur trade days. We know there was an incident where many of the Koniag were killed, especially the men. And then we know that Juana Maria was the lone island resident for much of the period that the cache feature appears to have been used. So we're getting more into the area of speculation, but I think it's at least a reasonable hypothesis to suggest that it was Juana Maria who cached these materials in these boxes. She was caching materials elsewhere on the island. This certainly overlaps with a large part of the time that she was on the island. If it wasn't Juana Maria, it probably was certainly one of her group, one of her family, perhaps. That's it. Thank you very much.